Okay, so now David has just, do I call you David or Professor Palmer?
David.
David. Okay, fair enough. Okay, so David has just outlined a typical framing for how we look at the interaction between science and religion. And when Ian Barber was speaking in Scotland in the 1980s, that was a very sensible way to approach the situation. The culture was sufficiently homogeneous that when people looked at religion, they were looking at a particular kind of religion, and they shared this understanding of what was going on. And similarly for science, there was a particular approach to science, and they knew what they were talking about, more or less. But we've moved away from the 1980s, and we've moved away from Scotland. And there are a lot of, within the original lecture series and the subsequent book, there are a lot of provisos and caveats and understanding that small print, which get left out in most of the discussions of these 4Cs, and which we left out in our discussion of the 4Cs. And so now we're going to pick up on some of those provisos, and particularly they're important because the further away you get from 1980s Scotland, the more important those assumptions become, because the more likely we are to be breaking those assumptions. So we're going to pick up this by looking at another set of lectures, Gifford lectures, given by someone else, this time by Peter Harrison, a few decades later. And he looked at science and religion and said, when we look at science and religion, we can think of it being a bit like Israel and Egypt. To use this analogy, he said, okay, we look at Israel and we look at Egypt, and we know where Israel is and we know where Egypt is, and most people more or less agree on roughly where they are, and there are some disputes, but we've got this idea. But as we move away from the 20th century, we can't talk about the relationship between Israel and Egypt 4 centuries ago, simply because there wasn't this thing called Israel and there wasn't this thing called Egypt. So if we look at a map here, we have, the Jordan River and the Nile River existed, and Alexandria and Jerusalem existed as cities, and there were people living there and working the land, but they weren't Egyptians or Israelites as their understanding of themselves would be. They were all citizens of a wider empire. And so if you say there was a conflict between Israel and Egypt 400 years ago, that can't be true, because there wasn't a thing called Israel and Egypt 400 years ago. Now, Peter Harrison was a historian of science and religion, and he said, in this similar then-now picture, if you ask what was the relationship between science and religion some number of centuries ago, it's really not necessarily a meaningful question, because what we currently understand as science and religion just didn't exist some number of centuries ago. So it's a relatively recent idea. So what Peter Harrison did with then and now, we're going to try and look at with here and there, not between the present day and historical times, but between, say, Europe and Hong Kong. What does science and religion look like in Hong Kong? And in the same way as Peter Harrison asked, can we use, or can we discuss a sort of non-modern or pre-modern situation without forcing it into our modernist terms? We're going to say, okay, well, if our current ideas of science and religion turned up in the modern West, can we look at situations outside of the modern West, like, for example, Hong Kong, without forcing our conversation into this modernist Western framework? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and say, okay, what is this modernist Western framework? And roughly speaking, how does it work? How do we think our way through it? And can we think our way through it without having to force things into those categories? So modernism lives for dichotomies. It loves pairs of ideas. So for example, science and religion. And the dichotomies are these nicely exclusive things. Okay, it's either scientific or it's religious. Natural and supernatural. Obviously, this is a dichotomy. They're different, right? One deals with apples, one deals with angels. They're different things. Testable and untestable. Law of the excluded middle says you can't have a testable, untestable thing. They're different. I'm sorry if this seems like you're like, I didn't come to university to learn something this trivial. What are you doing, Dr. Browner? But here we go. Bear with me. Objective and subjective, they're different. Otherwise, why we even have them? Facts and values, we have the fact-value distinction for a reason. It's because they're distinct. Public and private, if you didn't have separate spheres of life, society would fall apart. Knowledge and faith, the more knowledge you have, the less faith you need. The more faith you have, the less knowledge you need. These are different, distinct things. And we also have then as well as these groups, these dichotomies, we group them together. So everything on one side, we say, okay, these things belong together. And everything on the other side, we say these things belong together. So for example, facts are objective because they're testable, right? Values are subjective because they're not testable. You have your opinion, I have my opinion. And if we could test it, it wouldn't be an opinion, it would be a fact, right? These things go together. We believe in the supernatural by faith. Religion belongs in the private sphere. You can pray to whomever you want in your house, just don't do it out in the street. It's okay to teach science in public schools, right? These ideas, they all clump together. So when we look at science and religion within this framework, what we want to do is we want to say, can we take things from one column and connect them to things in another column? So for example, when we say, okay, I'm doing science and religion, questions come up like, oh, can you prove the existence of God? Is there experimental evidence that God exists? Why do we ask that kind of question? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to bridge these two columns. Experimental evidence shows objective knowledge. If we can prove something, we have objective knowledge of it. And if we're talking about God, this is the supernatural. So can you prove God exists means, can I have objective knowledge of the supernatural? Can I take something from column 1 and connect it with column 2? This is what we're trying to do. This is why we ask this question in discussions about science and religion. But what we're going to argue in the rest of this course is to say that these dichotomies, they're not as dichotomous as they think. And these connections happen all over the place. Religion, for example, makes natural statements. Science makes untestable statements. Science makes value-laden statements, just as religion makes factual statements. So these things, you can't sit them and break them down and go, okay, religion is everything in one column, science is everything in the other column, because in fact the columns cross back and forth between each other. And the problem doesn't stop there, because in fact these dichotomies we've set up, it turns out that the distinction between what's natural and what's supernatural, you know, angels are supernatural and apples are natural, it turns out when you sort of poke it a bit, it becomes a lot more tricky and nuanced and difficult to make this distinction than we might initially think. Objective and subjective blur into each other. It's very hard to stick a thing and say, okay, those are the objective ones and these are the subjective ones. Facts inhere values. So given we have these two columns which modernism loves, and modernism, you know, usually it defines science explicitly or implicitly in terms of these other things, and we think of religion explicitly or implicitly in terms of these other things. But when we take a step back and we say these categories don't have to be separate, and religion can reach across one way and science can reach across the other way, and indeed should and must, and everything gets muddled up, then our neat categories of this is science and this is religion start to break down. So this is where we're going to go over the next rest of the course.